Hello and welcome back to the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Esther Thorpe, and in this podcast, Chris Sutcliffe, Peter Houston and I are exploring the people and products powering publishing, both through the podcast and our adjacent weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at voices.media. Now, if you're a publisher with a potentially award-winning podcast, the Publisher Podcast Awards 2025 are open for entries until the 14th of March. You can go to publisherpodcasts.com for categories and more, and there is a super early bird deal on tickets for both the awards and the Publisher Podcast Summit. We're really pleased to have Memberful as sponsors for this season of the Publisher Podcast. You can easily set up and manage your membership program with Memberful's intuitive features, from multiple membership tiers and payment options to cater to different audience segments and maximise your revenue potential. Take control of your publishing business with Memberful. You can visit memberful.com/publisherpod. That's memberful.com/publisherpod to get started with a free trial. This week we're joined by Press Gazette's Chief Commercial Officer Richard Jamieson for a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at revenue at the industry publication. He talks about the opportunities he saw coming onto a B2B brand which had previously had limited commercialisation but a really strong audience, some big changes to their daily newsletter over the last 18 months, what their overall revenue mix now looks like, and their newly launched registration wall. So I started by asking Richard how he came to be at Press Gazette, and what it is for those who don't yet know.
Well, I'm now entering my 24th year in publishing and media.
Oh!
Yeah, I joined a company called Sterling Publications in September 2001. It's my first job out of uni. My first day on the sales floor was 9/11, which was quite an experience. So that's a day that will live long in the memory for more than the obvious reason. And I've actually stayed with this company to this very day. It's the same company, but we've changed names a few times. I mean, we've been Sterling Publications, SPG Media, Compello, Progressive Media, New Statesman Media Group, Global Data. But fundamentally, I've always been in the commercial and sales teams and various leadership roles. And then joined Press Gazette 5 years ago this month. Press Gazette was one of the brands that the owner of the New Statesman has in his sort of portfolio.
Because I think people are quite familiar with the New Statesman, but possibly didn't know that they owned a B2B media brand. Yep,
that's right. Press Gazette is a long-standing B2B brand. It's been published since the 1960s. For those that don't know, it was a sort of a weekly print title, sort of a trade journal for journalists in Fleet Street from the 1960s and for much of its history. The last decade or so has sort of pivoted to a digital only, and the audience has really broadened to just more than just journalists and editors. So it's anybody in sort of commercial, product, tech, content, audience data. So any of the sort of functions you'll find in a modern day publisher or news organisation, you'll find those people on the readership list of Press Gazette.
So you came to Press Gazette 5 years ago. What did the brand look like when you came in, and what was your remit with it?
So I was working on a completely different part of the business. It was one of our sort of B2B content marketing products covering professional services. And I was sort of getting a little bit fed up of it, frankly. So I asked the CEO to give me a product to look at. So he said, Press Gazette doesn't have a sales team at the moment. It was just the editorial team at the time. Apart from one guy who sort of split his time between the New Statesman and Press Gazette, and he did the British Journalism Awards. So Press Gazette's only sort of commercial offering was the British Journalism Awards. So I took a look at the subscriber list to the newsletter. I looked at the demographics of who was coming to the site. I looked at the contributors. I looked at the lead base for it, and I thought we're sitting on an absolute goldmine here. I mean, I looked through that newsletter subscriber list, and it was a who's who of UK news. And in fact, some of the bigger US news organisations, their sort of C-level and executive teams were on the list. So I thought there's an opportunity here for us to really monetize more than what we're doing just through the British Journalism Awards. So the brief was, how do we monetize the digital assets, the newsletter, the website? Can we introduce any other opportunities? And yeah, within the first 12 months, we'd launched 3 different sets of events. We'd really successfully monetized the newsletter. We'd started selling sponsored content. Advertising started going through the site. We used the podcast. So it all snowballed pretty quickly, actually. And that's really down to the fact that we had a product that was really loved, really well subscribed to from an audience of senior people, And then we identified the organisations that wanted to be in front of those people and sell their services and products. So after that, it was a fairly simple process.
I'm slightly surprised that there was no dedicated sort of sales resource or monetisation before then. I don't know if maybe, was it just sort of seen as a B2B brand on the side? Because Press Gazette cover publishers and how publishers make money. So it's just slightly surprising that they hadn't done that themselves up until that point.
I mean, yes, everybody was surprised that it took off so quickly because they just hadn't put the resources onto that product. We have a large sales team, but we had a load of B2B magazines that, you've never heard of, but which did really well commercially. And it just didn't seem attractive for whatever reason to any of the internal sales team. So the British Journalism Awards were doing quite well, but yeah, nobody was on it. And I can't really tell you why. You'd have to ask the previous CEOs about that.
I think the other thing that people who've known Press Gazette for many years will have spotted that around that time as well, the editorial started to get really, really good. Like there was quite clear investment in an editorial team. To what extent do you think that it was the editorial side needed investment and focus as well as the sales opportunities? Or did it very much go hand in hand?
The Press Gazette editorial team are superb, and they always have been. The content has always been absolutely outstanding. And that's one of the reasons that it does so well. Content is king, and I think people really enjoy the content that Dominic, Charlotte, Bron, and prior to that, Will Turville and Freddie Mayhew have put together and continue to publish on Press Gazette. To answer your question, I don't think it needed changing. I think what happened when I came in was I sort of identified other areas that were maybe outside of their traditional ecosystem that would enable us to monetize it better. So, really focusing on opportunities which would align with the lead base. So, subscriptions, payments, content management, pushing a little bit more into ad tech. Because there are a lot of vendors out there, a lot of solution providers that want to reach our audience, but perhaps were skeptical because we weren't covering those areas as much in the editorial. So I don't think it needed changing. I just think it was a good opportunity for us to broaden the editorial scope of Press Gazette. And thankfully, working with Dominic and Charlotte, they're very commercially minded as well. So they were very open to that opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that they listen to any sort of guidance from me on the editorial. We're very much church and state in terms of commercial editorial teams, but they're very helpful. And any opportunity they can offer for us to monetize a certain area or take on guidance from me in terms of, I think this is an area we could cover and we could really do well from, they're always open to that.
You mentioned there was a bit of an audience shift from journalists to sort of more executive level. Was that just to do with the coverage, or was that just sort of saying, we're not going to maybe focus on policy issues quite as much? Was that an active decision to focus on a more senior group than maybe just broader journalists?
I think the audience was there already. But I mean, when I joined, there was a senior audience in those newsletter subscribers coming to the website, coming to obviously the British Journalism Awards. I think the fact that we'd only done the British Journalism Awards as an in-person event meant that we only saw that element of the readership, the journalists, the editors, the UK news teams. And obviously we continue to do so. We had another great event last month. When we started focusing our events or bringing more events to the roster, which focused on tech and product and revenue and content areas, those decision makers came, they spoke. I mean, if you look back over the last 4 years or so, look at the speaker list that we've had, the attendee lists that we've had in London and New York, it is a who's who of news and media and publishing decision makers. And it's never been a problem for them to give us their time. It's never been a struggle. We've never had to pick up the phone and go, hi, we're from Press Gazette, would you like? They're like, oh, absolutely, yeah. We're big fans, we're readers, how can we help? So I wouldn't say that there was an internal decision to say, let's move away from journalists and editors. They're a massive and important part of the readership of Press Gazette, and they always will be. But I think we started to capitalise on the fact that we were reaching other people outside of those functions as well.
Mm. So you mentioned your events there. What does your events portfolio look like now? I suppose what's on the 2025 calendar? Because you've got quite a range from, there's quite a big conference to a lot smaller sort of breakfasts and dinners.
Yeah, so we've got three main formats. So we do this thing called the Media 100, where we basically invite between 40 and 50 C-level or C-level -1 UK news, media and publishing executives for a sort of a breakfast.
Not 100?
No. We call it the Media 100 because that's sort of the community from which we draw. It's like the top 100 media executives, and then we will invite a certain segment of those to each event. So we do 3 or 4 of those every year in London. We do it at the top of the Gherkin. It's like a 2-hour breakfast, and we have a fireside chat with a well-known CEO. So we've had the CEO of The Telegraph, The Guardian, The Independent, Bloomberg, Sky News, Hearst, Future, all of the usual sort of tier 1 brands that you might be familiar with. And then we have that sponsored by 2 or 3 commercial partners who come in and can network with our audience there. So that's the smallest event we do, but probably has the highest concentration of senior people. We then do these roundtable events. So in the UK, they're called the Future of Media Trends. That's basically 75 people. We have sort of 6 or 7 tables, and that's owned by a partner. So typically a tech partner or sponsor on a certain topic. So they sort of own that topic, and then we invite people to come along and sit on that table and discuss that topic, whether it's revenue strategies or paywalls or subscription strategies or licensing opportunities, whatever the case may be. And in as part of that event, we have a revenue leader panel, typically CROs, and we have a CEO or president speaking in a fireside chat as well at the end of the day. Now, we replicate that event in New York as well. So we were only doing 1 a year for the last 2 years. This year we're doing 2, 1 in March, 1 in November. It's called something slightly different, but it's essentially the same format. Sort of roundtable discussions and then senior leaders speaking. And then we've got the big conference, the Future of Media Technology, conference and awards, which is every September in London. Last year we had about 500 people attend, and that's a typical conference format really. So panels, roundtables, keynotes, customer success stories. We have a sort of sponsor lounge as well, and that's growing year on year and has done since we first launched in 2021, I think it was the first one.
Yeah, because I think a lot of your events have sprung up just after the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the brief. I think people were a bit fed up of sort of the virtual events, and webinars, and I certainly was. And people wanted to have that connection with their peers, with their clients, with their colleagues in person. So, timing was great for us to launch those. They've only succeeded because we've continued to deliver really high quality content, in my opinion. And we're very, very privileged and lucky that we've got a fantastic list of companies as sponsors and sort of partners that continue to support us.
Do you do anything on the virtual side?
We do. I mean, as part of Progressive Media, or previously New Statesman Media Group, we had a webinar division. And that was predominantly our B2B magazine. So, titles covering energy, oil and gas, airports, hotels, FMCG. That's actually now been sold to our sort of parent company, Global Data. So they're over there now. So we don't actually have a webinar team anymore. I try to sort of shy away from them because I don't feel as in control of the webinars and generating that delegate audience as much as an in-person event, even if it's a bespoke event. So having said that, we did a fantastic webinar with I think he was the chief operating officer of the Boston Globe a couple of months ago. Dominic interviewed him, and we did that on behalf of the client. And we had great numbers and great profile of people that signed up. But it's not something that we're going to focus on this year outside of the podcast.
You mentioned a while back about the newsletter. I'm a subscriber to the daily newsletter. That's had quite a transformation in the last 18 months. I think you've moved it all to Substack. It's sort of had design changes and quite clearly some monetisation changes. I'd love to just get a sense of what journey has that newsletter been on, and particularly on the commercial side, when you're taking a daily newsletter out to sell, how do you approach that? Because that's quite an intimidating proposition.
To be honest with you, I think we could improve that process because I think we could be more aligned. The commercial and the editorial teams could probably be more aligned in terms of, Dominic or Charlotte might come to me and say, look, for February, here are the topics we're going to cover. How does that align with your sort of client base and what they want to push into the market? As it stands at the moment, it's a little bit more ad hoc. So we'll sign deals with, our advertisers and our sponsors, and they will literally say, here's the sort of timing that we're looking for. What's the availability? And then we'll look and we'll see what's on the schedule. And if those spots are open, we'll put them in. But yeah, I think the biggest transformation on the newsletter, aside from the monetization side of it, has been moving to Substack, because I think that's allowed Dominic and the marketing and the audience teams to really generate a little bit more insight into the performance of the newsletter in terms of who's reading it, for how long, the normal KPIs that a lot of advertisers will be looking for feedback on. So I think it looks a lot better. When it pops up in my inbox, it's a lot easier to read versus the previous edition. And we'll continue to expand on that. And I think, we'll be aiming to try and do slightly more regional versions as we move into the second half of this year. The companies that have worked with us and have put in some gated content, so case studies or white papers or anything that you've got to basically put your details in to download, they've worked really well. And that's something that I really encourage our partners to do, rather than just an MPU or a banner ad in the newsletter. Actually put something in there that people can take away.
So you've got all of that going on. So I guess, what does the overall revenue mix look like now for Press Gazette?
We're very much skewed to events. The events are a huge part. I mean, I would say, giving you sort of ballpark numbers here, it's probably 2/3 events.
Okay.
And a third digital. One of my remits this year is to try and monetize the digital assets a little bit more and maintain what we're doing on the event side, of course. But there's a resource issue there as well. I've recently hired somebody out in the States, so that's going to help. But I think we're really, really strong on the event side, and we're quite lucky that most of the clients that we work with, I would say at this point, again, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but probably over 90% renew with us for the events. We want to get those numbers up a little bit more on the digital side.
Talking of digital side and potential monetization, you put a registration wall live just before Christmas. So I'd love to know what's the thinking behind that, the roadmap. I assume there's a commercial angle incoming.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the content that the team produce on Press Gazette is top tier. I think there is a value exchange to be had there, whether that is personal information or company information in terms of providing us with a little bit more insight into who's coming to our site and who's reading our content, or further down the line, paying for that content. I think is completely justified. I mean, we sort of tested it a little bit with certain segments of the readership and asked them outright, would you pay for access to Press Gazette? And it was a resounding yes. Yes, we would. Having never done it before on any of the titles that I've worked on, and I don't think Dominic has either, it is a little bit of trial and error in terms of finding the right price point as and when we get to that stage, which we're aiming for H2 this year. But the reg wall was a no-brainer. I think it's very important for us to have a clearer understanding of who's coming to the site, who's subscribing to the newsletter, and everything about them. And that will enable us to serve them better content and sort of meet their needs more. It will enable us to engage with them more. And of course, yes, we are a for-profit title. It will enable us to present our commercial partners with better opportunities to engage with them.
I don't know if there's a potential nervousness about maybe hampering some of the reach and growth of new audiences, but I suppose you'd know better who is already on the site.
Yeah, that was a concern. We've got really good numbers coming to the site on a monthly basis. At one point, and I think it might even still be the case, we were the most read title in the world in the English language for publishing news and media. I'm not sure we necessarily need to have all of those people. I think we'd much rather have a smaller overall number, but a closer relationship and a more frequent relationship. So, we would call them in the wider group, we had a project couple of years back starting where we would call these people the MVPs, people who are engaging with your content on a more regular basis and more of a senior decision-making role. Those are the people that we want coming to the site more regularly. And if that means a drop-off in the overall numbers, I think that's an exchange we're willing to make.
And I feel like that's what gets to the heart of what B2B media should really be focusing on anyway, right?
Totally, yeah. I think some of these things are vanity metrics, aren't they? We've got X number of millions of visitors to the site every month. There aren't a million decision makers in news publishing media in the world. So we would never want that number. We do want to provide the industry with a resource that they will go to and that they will come to every day, or that they will look to as a sort of benchmark for industry information. And we want those senior execs speaking and coming to our events. And we're in a position where we currently have that. Yes, we want to build on that, but I think we need to build on that outside of the UK, where we're very, very well known. The US is probably coming up to about a quarter of our readers now online. but that's very much concentrated in the sort of the New York news and media sector. So there's a massive opportunity for us in the States outside of New York, and there is a huge opportunity for us, particularly in sort of more English-speaking European countries, Scandinavia and the DACH region in particular, and also given the number of newspapers in those countries, lots of opportunities for us to expand our readership and our event footprint as well.
Yeah. Is that something you would do from the UK? Because I've heard a lot of people say that the US media market is quite different and it can sometimes catch people out.
Yeah, I mean, throughout my career, I've always had, the majority of my clients have always been in the States for whatever reason, in any sector I've worked in. And it's no different with Press Gazette, actually. We do have someone on the ground now in the States. We used to have an office out there for the group. But no, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. I think it depends on the part of the industry you're talking about. So we were very clear about the fact that we had quite a lot of commercial revenue ad operations people coming through on the newsletter subscribers, coming to the events and so on. And so that sort of ad tech part of publishing, which we're not really heavily into, or we weren't up to this point, that needed somebody with a little bit more experience and the contacts and the relationships which none of us in the UK had. So that's why we hired this person out in the States, because that's her sort of forte, that specific part of the ecosystem.
Yeah. Has anything not worked for you over the last 2 years?
I mean, at a wider group level, yes. I mean, Press Gazette, we've been quite fortunate. Most of the things we've tried have come off. There's a couple of things that I can't mention that we're going to be doing this year on Press Gazette, which will really test that theory. But I will be happy to give you an update on that mid-year. I think we struggled a little bit with a Germany event that we did in September, but I don't think the sample size was big enough for us to say that it wouldn't work. It was a very strange time. There was a massive event taking place in Denmark at the time, so a lot of the people that we were speaking to were like, yes, we'd love to come, but we're already at this event. So no, I don't think we've had too many challenges on the Press Gazette side. As a publisher in the wider group, we have had a few products that have on paper looked amazing and just have not worked. So there was one that we did about sort of sustainable finance within the wider group, and everybody wanted to read about it. There was a lot of good feedback and positive feedback about the content, and the content team and the editorial team were fantastic. But the commercial teams just could not make any inroads because it wasn't an area that they could monetize particularly well.
So I just sort of want to get just before we move on to the next bit, a big picture of, I think you mentioned on LinkedIn you tripled revenue. I don't know if that's an up-to-date figure. But from when you've come in, what's this sort of overall picture of success look like in terms of sort of context and scale?
Yeah, so just to reiterate, Press Gazette was really only monetising the British Journalism Awards as a brand. And they were doing that pretty successfully. So Kalpesh, who looks after that, has done a fantastic job and continues to do so. Yeah, it was triple-digit growth, sort of 2021, 2022 again, so 2 years in a row. And then that has continued with going from that base, double-digit growth, 2023, 2024. Vast majority of that has come through the events, but it's been really enjoyable. And actually, I don't want to say it's not been difficult. It's always difficult, isn't it? All of us in sales, you've always got to work your proverbials off. But it's been a real positive aspect for me, having come from sort of a B2B background where those products are not particularly well known. So even getting through the door is a challenge, to working on Press Gazette, whereas, yes, of course I know Press Gazette. How can what would you like to discuss? That doesn't mean everybody buys from you, but it does mean that they're open to a conversation. And I think if we can demonstrate the value to them and how that will help their business, 7 or 8 times out of 10, they normally book something with us.
Is there a playbook when it comes to monetising publications like this, or is that very much going to depend on the publication audience? Let's say you came into a different business, a different B2B business. Would you use that same playbook, or would it just depend on what they had going on?
Given the background that I have coming from sort of Sterling Publications, Cornhill, SPG Media, where we were launching new magazines, print magazines, on a monthly basis, I would follow that process, because if you follow that process, you can't go too far wrong. And that is, do we have a product that people want to read? Is the content compelling? Is there an audience there? Fine, okay, that's step one. If the audience is there, what's the lead base? If there isn't a lead base, you're not going to make any money from it. And typically we would say, are there sort of 2,000 companies worldwide feeding into this sector, whether it's oil and gas or power or packaging or airport. So with Press Gazette, half of that job was already done. A very well-established audience, a fantastic pedigree and track record over many, many years. Probably a slightly smaller lead base than most B2B titles, certainly the more industrial side of things. And obviously Press Gazette has a slight hindrance in the fact that it is UK and US predominantly. So, if you're not in those countries, you won't necessarily have heard of it. So that's a slight hindrance. But as I said, that's not something that we can't overcome, because if we start broadening the audience out into a more European or even more in the US and North America, then that will open up even more of a lead base for us. So I guess the playbook is, I think it will be the same wherever you go. You're going to have a lot of advantages if you've got a very well-established title, but I think the principles are the same in terms of, is the content compelling enough to create an audience? Are the audience engaged? Are they coming back? Are they subscribing? And if they are, and if they're an audience that people want to be put in front of and sell their goods to, their services, their products, then you're going to be okay.
Where do you see if you mention AI, you're going to need to provide us where do you see the biggest growth opportunities in publishing, and tied into that, what's next for Press Gazette?
I think for publishing, we've you've set me up to fail there, haven't you? I think for publishing, we've got to start recognising that we are the gatekeepers, right? The content that we as publishers are producing is what people are after. Everything else is a bolt-on to that. It shouldn't be the other way around, whether that's ad tech, whether it is language learning models, ChatGPT, whatever you want to call it. And I think the relationship with the big tech platforms, of course, is something that needs to be completely reversed. Dominic's been very vocal about this. I don't think we need to bend over to their will or see that them offering to pay for certain elements of the content is a generous thing for them to do. I think what we need to do is find some figureheads and to act as an industry to push forward this notion that we're creating some fantastic content. Now, whether that's news content or whether it is very niche B2B titles, people are willing to pay and willing to engage with you for that content. And that is your USP. And we've lost sight of that a little bit, I think. For Press Gazette, we're going to practice what we preach. We've got a fantastic audience. We're producing superb content. We run great events, and we're going to double down on that. The Reg Wall has helped us to do that. We're going to push through to a paywall in the second half of the year. We might think about bringing back a print version of Press Gazette, because I think that would be not just a nice touch. I think it's something that people would actually want.
In that case, you guys need to be at our print summit in June.
Yeah, well, absolutely happy to come along. And I think for us, a key focus for 2025 will be to consolidate what we've been doing in the United States. We're doing a couple of events over there, but we really want to grow the audience and get the recognition. Because frankly, there isn't really anything in the market like Press Gazette in the States, which is mind-blowing. But obviously, it's a little bit more of a fragmented setup over there in terms of media and publishing. But there's definitely an opportunity for us to do that.
Thanks so much to Richard for coming on to speak to us. And don't forget, we'll have a write-up of the key learnings from this interview on voices.media, or dropped into your inbox every Tuesday if you sign up to the publisher newsletter, also on voices.media. This season is sponsored by Memberful, a best-in-class membership solution which is fully customisable to cater to your different audience segments. Find out more about how it can help diversify your revenue streams and connect with your audience at memberful.com/publisherpod. We'll be back next week with another dive into the people and products powering publishing's future. In the meantime, if you've got an app, podcast, newsletter, or print magazine, pop over to publishersummits.com to take advantage of our super early bird ticket offer on sale until the 19th of February. Until then, you can keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the publisher newsletter on voices.media. See you next week.